Hello, and welcome to LangTime Chat, episode 37, an episode focusing on borrowing. What do you think about that, David?
Oh, I think that's fine.
You are so not excited.
Oh, I am very excited. I was focusing internally to make sure I didn't have a particular physical manifestation.
For borrowing? Okay.
But if we were going to jump right in, though,
As we do.
I did want to start with something. Today is February 27th.
It is.
2023. And so it is now
It's our third
3 years.
Langiversary.
Third Langiversary.
Today. And if you know, it's episode 37, which means we have completed 3 full years worth of podcasts, because episode 36 would have been 3 full years. And so, timely. We haven't missed one, in other words.
That's right. It's pretty wild. And, I have to say, I'm always glad if anybody who either listens to the podcasts or watches us on LangTime Studio enjoys it and gets something out of it. But I've always thought of LangTime Studio as something for us, and I am just so grateful to be where I am 3 years from then.
It's really crazy to think it's only been 3 years. It's also crazy to think back on, when we started and the goals we thought we had and what we were doing. And we really had no idea what to expect. It was really just let's put it out there and see what happens. And I think one of the most surprising results was just how amazing and strong of a community that has grown out of it. I could not have predicted 3 years ago that, we'd be chit-chatting with people on Discord, through LangTime. I didn't really anticipate so many of those cool things, and so it's quite exciting to me. And so now when we're doing these podcasts, I don't feel like we're sending them to the void. I feel like we're sending them to our people.
Yeah.
Our community.
And also, this is really nice because this one was your idea.
Well, I took the idea. This podcast? The actual podcast.
Yeah, the fact that we have a podcast at all, that was your idea.
That is true, which is why I ran it for so long, and then every once in a while David took over just to help out for, when I was busy or lots of things going on in life. But yeah, the reason we even have a podcast is because I was like, let's do it.
It's the longest lasting podcast I've ever been involved with, and I've been involved with a couple.
Go us.
Yeah, I'm really, honestly, I'm just really, really proud of you.
Oh, thank you.
And so grateful for you.
Wow, and now I'm blushing. All right, so today's episode, moving in, because I'm staring at our current slide, 1 out of 147. I've got some slides to get through.
Right on.
I also wanted to mention this particular topic was born out of, from LangTime community members. There had been a suggestion previously, I forget when, it's actually been a while ago now. There had been a suggestion that we talk more about borrowing, which we've touched on in other topics, but this one's going to fully focus on it. And then more recently, there was someone, I think it was Bubba actually, who had said, how about you do something focusing on, the English language and history of the English language? And so I thought, why not put the two together and have a focus on borrowing and tie it into a brief introduction to the history of the English language, because English has been an epic borrower of words throughout its history. And as a speaking community, it seems like there have been a lot of eras where people were super open to borrowing, which is not always the case. Not all speaking communities want to expand their vocabulary in that way, and that's fine. That is totally fine. I think sometimes English speakers were confused, which we'll get into, because of the mass borrowings. There was definitely a period where we had too many borrowings and people didn't know what to do with the words. Mm-hmm. And so we'll get into those. But yeah, we'll talk about the history of English alongside the concept of borrowing. So first, as a brief overview for sort of a timeline for grounding yourself, if you're thinking, well, what does the history of the English language entail? Of course, we could go way back in time to Proto-Indo-European days for the family tree of English. And one of my favorite little infographic images to use, there are tons of these available online. This is by no means the only one. I just find the color coding of this particular one very soothing, because it's like this blue and it's written so nicely, and I like the black with the blue.
For those that are just listening, I mean, it's just white paper with hand-drawn black lines, and then beneath that,
do you know? I don't know. No, I know what it reminds me of. It reminds me of my old German dictionary, my handheld German dictionary, because the headwords were all in blue, and then the black ink for the rest of the entries. And so it's like, I think it just reminds me of that, and it immediately puts my brain at like a very special place. It's just blue and black. I get it. It's really not that special, but like, I love it. But what it is the sort of expansion of saying, here's a Proto-Indo-European root that linguists have identified. This one in particular is for the number 2. And so it goes back to something like dwoch as a root way back when. And then it traces it out through, a lot of different languages, and gives you, examples of how it evolved. I almost said mutated, but I don't really like that word. Mm-hmm. It evolved, which required mutation. But anyway, specifically, English belongs to the Germanic languages. And so on that particular infographic, which, traced all these roots through different language family parts, we're looking specifically at Proto-Germanic, where dwoch became something like twy in Proto-Germanic. Even more specifically, so not only is English a Germanic language, but it is a West Germanic language. And so of the Germanic languages listed here, not all of them are. This is just a small sampling on this particular infographic. But of the ones that are listed, we of course have English, the number 2. We have German, zwei, Yiddish, zwei, and Dutch, I believe it's twee. The W is a W in Dutch, or is it a V?
Oh, the W is a W.
Okay, so twee in Dutch. And so those are the West Germanic languages, as opposed to the North Germanic languages like Icelandic, Tver, and Danish, To, and so on.
And of course, the W is silent in English, as we all know.
It is. And so, it's got to make you think, though, because at one point it was pronounced, which is why it's spelled, and also why we have like twice,
yep,
and, like those kinds of things. But yeah, that tuo just kind of eventually tu.
You know what? I mean, what probably happened, it was probably, tuo, which was long, and then the long vowel rose due to the great vowel shift, and then it became tu,
and
it's
like,
just
who can say that?
Yeah.
That's just ridiculous. And so specifically, as English was going from those, Proto-Germanic and West Germanic stages into its own separate language from the other West Germanic languages, we can break English down into different stages.
Hold on. We got to go back just real quick. So this is, what is that, Proto-Germanic?
Yeah.
Okay. So reconstructed from Proto-Germanic is twy. Mm-hmm. And so Proto-Indo-European was dwo. Dwo goes to twy. Back to two.
It
just in English. Anyway, I'm sorry. That's very twee of me. I'm so sorry.
We have things to get through, David. Mm-hmm. Okay, so within the history of English, like once we start looking at it's going from a West Germanic language to its own flavor of language apart from German and Dutch and the other ones. The very first stage that linguists have identified, Old English, started around 450, the year 450, as in the Common Era. Mind you, like when people were speaking it, they didn't even call it English back then. And so scholars will refer to it sometimes as Anglo-Saxon because the Angles and Saxons were two of the groups of people who spoke it. And so Anglo-Saxon is another way to refer to this language. When they did start calling it English, which is from the Angles name, so English is English. When they started calling it that, of course, they never called it Old English because when they were speaking it, it was modern. It was current. It was what we speak. And so it's really important to know, like, to get your head in that mind frame of like, they had no idea that their language was going to eventually get called Old English. So this was around the year 450 when that started. Now, the only reason linguists put that year as like the starting point of Old English is not because like there's some linguistic identifier where the English spoken in 449 differed from the English spoken in 451. And so there's like this placeholder we can put. It's because of an external event. It's because that was roughly around the year or the time frame where the Angles, Saxons, and Utes went from continental Europe to the area that we now call England. And so they migrated over there. Now, according to some Anglo writing, this was an event precipitated by all of the indigenous Celtic peoples needing protection from other invaders. And so they so kindly left continental Europe and came over to their land to help protect them from invaders. So according to some writings, they were invited. If you read other historical accounts, though, not so much an invitation as, oh, we're going to take this land that the Romans have left behind because the Roman Empire had expanded into the island area. And when the Roman soldiers left, there was sort of this void of land that was ripe for the taking. And by ripe for the taking, I mean, really, it was just, who's going to be the next conqueror of people who don't want to be bothered or conquered by other people. And so anyway, it's kind of interesting, though, if you read the old Anglo-Saxon chronicles where it's like they put a really cute spin on that historical account. So that's around 450 is when we say Old English began, because at that point it was isolated from what was being spoken on continental Europe, which means that it necessarily started changing into its own language separate from what was going on the continent. Middle English is the period that we say begins in the year 1066. That's even more specific than 450. So 1066, a very specific year. Once again, we put that pinpoint as the start of Middle English because of an external thing, and that was because the Norman conquest happened. And so it's a really convenient way to say, hey, here's this external event that happened. And yes, the language did change significantly after that, and we'll talk about some of that. But again, it's not like the English spoken a year or before or after was so different linguistically. It's just that's a convenient point to put on it. And then finally, modern English begins around the year 1500. This one is the most difficult line to draw because there's really no external factor that marks the beginning of this stage. So there's not mass migration. There's not, like Norman conquest. There's not something like that to mark it. Instead, usually what people say is like about when the Great Vowel Shift had finished is when modern English begins. Some scholars break it down into early modern English and modern English. And so some people break it down even more where early modern English is like the 15 and 1600s and then modern English is after that. And so this one, again, is more difficult because there's just not a convenient external thing to say, here's when that began.
In literature, there's something that is handy. So there's a very famous book called The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer that I think was, 1366?
That doesn't sound right. 1364 sounds 1362.
Let's see.
Maybe one.
The can't.
This is going to be where we get hung up, is what was the precise year.
Written between 1387 and 1400.
There we go,
How about
1387.
that?
There we
All
go.
right. Late 14th century. And this is written in Middle English to the extent that you need to study a little bit before you can read it. You can kind of get the gist of it, you know, if you've had a little bit of a primer ahead of time and you've got extensive footnotes, but it's clearly a different language. There is another book, an epic poem written by Edmund Spenser called The Faerie Queene that was written in 1590. And this book is written in the best way that you can say it is he was trying to make it sound like Chaucer by writing in an old-timey way. And it is markedly different in that it's things are much more regular, first of all, and they're also a lot less accurate, I guess, to the actual language that was spoken and written back in the 14th century. And so you can tell that between these two dates, you know, late 14th century and late 16th century, something has happened to the point where language has changed enough that the best this guy can do is try to imitate it. And it's kind of like people nowadays saying, you know, thou hast and things like that. It's like we've got some sort of a system in there that we've kind of learned from each other in television, but it's not real. It's our best attempt at trying to sound old-timey. And so, yeah, there's an example of that from 1590. Kind of interesting.
Thou hast beset my intentions. So that is convenient. There you go. Language had changed enough at that point. All right, so that is Set the Stage Part 1. Those are roughly the year time frames we're looking at when we're talking about the English language. Part 2 is another little educational bit for anybody who is not super familiar with reading etymologies. I did want to take a moment to just talk about how to look at and read and glean information from an etymology or an origin section like you might find in a dictionary. And this is really important, just a really, really good skill to have as a conlanger, because so often you can get inspiration for evolving words and their semantic meanings in your own conlang by looking at what natural languages have done, because there are some really, really cool shifts that have happened in natural languages that can inspire you. And so we're going to just take a moment. Again, this is sort of an educational block. And so this may be review for you, maybe old hat, but for some of you, you may never have really thought too much about how to actually read and get good information out of etymologies. And so as a starting example, we're looking at the etymology of the word me. So, you know, that pronoun me. And so first and foremost, this was based on a word found in Old English, me. And what happens is at the beginning of the etymology, it's going to put like the part of the language, like when its first attestation was in the language. So in this case, it's been part of the language since its earliest stages, because we don't go further back than Old English when we're talking about what is a word in English. Old English is the furthest we can go back in English. And so that means this word has been around a long time. And so that's where the etymology it starts. It says, when is the oldest attestation of this word in the English language? And so this one is old, as you may have guessed. It goes on to say, okay, that's the accusative and dative form of I. It's of Germanic origin. So that means, you know, it's part of our older history as well, because it goes further back than just Old English. It goes back to when it was, you know, part of the West Germanic and then Proto-Germanic stage. Anytime in an etymology you see related to, that is a phrase used a lot. Another way to think about that is cognate with. And so here it says related to Dutch me, German mir. And so that means it's cognate with those. That means it shares a history with those. That means at one point in this word's history, it was the same word that eventually became these different forms in these modern languages.
That's a Dutch May.
Thank you. I'm really bad at Dutch diphthongs.
May, yeah.
But I'm glad David's here to rescue me.
Oh, yeah. Me, who's famously great with them.
Better than me. I do my best, but as you can tell from my pronunciation, I did not get it right. This one is an even older root, so it goes back to the Germanic days, but it actually reaches way back into Proto-Indo-European roots, which you can see by reading further into the etymology here, where it says from an Indo-European root. So again, that means it's got cognates across, the entire Indo-European family. And here it gives examples shared by Latin me, Greek eme, and Sanskrit ma. So here, this is a super old root that's just like part of the language, been part of the language, and you can in fact trace its relatives across the entire branch of Indo-European languages. And so that's an old word. As another example, so this is an example where you can trace it back all the way to Indo-European roots. Sometimes it doesn't go that far back. It only goes back to, say, the Germanic roots. In other words, it's something shared by Germanic languages and nobody else in the Indo-European family. An example of that is our word dew, D-E-W, so like the condensation that you see in the morning on grass. That was from the Old English word dew. It's of Germanic origin. So again, old word, native to English, been there since our Germanic days. And it's cognate with other German languages with words like Dutch. Go ahead and say it, David. No? Oh. Dough?
I mean, one has to assume something like that.
Well, modern German Tau, or tauen as a verb. And so David's looking up the Dutch pronunciation. We really should have, and by we, I mean me, because you're just being surprised by all this. I really should have contacted Mateus and gotten a little lesson before trying to say these words.
Oh, it says
dough.
Dough.
No. Dough.
I mean, according to this thing.
Okay.
Whoa, hold on a sec.
David's going to play it.
Dough.
Dough.
Dough. Huh.
Okay, so that's...
I never would have guessed that.
That's the cognate in Dutch.
Not in a million years.
And so, again, notice here it stops at of Germanic origin, which is a way of saying this is a Germanic root, but unrelated to other Indo-European languages. Another thing that you can see in etymology entries is something like you see in the etymology for dog. It's an Old English word, doga, or doja, and it's of unknown origin. In other words, who knows? Who knows where we got this word? We don't. There are some theories you can read up in other sources. Sometimes you'll see one source says of unknown origin and another source will be like, no, we think it's this. But at that point, they're really guessing. Another surprising one, so this is an everyday word where it's like, how do we not know where that came from? Another surprising one is the word pink. Like that's actually unknown origin according to most sources.
Really?
Yeah. And it's like so weird. And so some have traced it back to the name of a flower, like a part of a name of a flower. And some sources trace it back to the term that meant pink eye. And they associated it with the color, but it never was named after the color of the eye. It was actually named after something else entirely.
Oh.
And then that color got associated with color.
Whoa.
And so that's another one where it's like sources, some will just straight up say unknown and others will be like, here's a guess. But yeah, so sometimes we have no idea where these words come from. Another example, so these are all native words, in other words, never been borrowed into English. They're just part of the language. Or they came into English through unknown means. An example of a borrowed word in the etymology is something like the word character. And notice here the etymology starts with Middle English. What that means is it came into the language during Middle English days, so it's not something you would find in Old English documents. So the earliest we see the word character in English is during those Middle English stages. So that sets the tone for this etymology. We know that this is a later word in terms of development. And then from there, we learn it's from Old French, and so that tells us who the English speakers of Middle English times borrowed it from. They were interacting with speakers of what we call Old French, and so those English speakers borrowed that word from them. And then it goes from there. It's written in backwards chronological order. I almost said chronicle instead. Oops. Chronological order. And so it's not a word native to French. French, of course, had it because of Latin, and that is, Latin is French's mother language. But Latin didn't just have this word. They had, in fact, borrowed it from Greek. And so the etymology keeps going back in time to say, here's the earliest we can find it in English. Now let's trace it back to as far as we can go. And in this case, Greek is the furthest back we can go. The original meaning of the word character from Greek was actually a stamping tool. And so it was from the early sense distinctive mark. And from that came the idea of token, feature, or trait. And from that, so after the 16th century, it became used to mean a description, especially of a person's qualities. And so that's where that came from a stamping tool.
I like it.
That's pretty cool. Again, you can learn fun things from etymologies. Another example is our word quote, which was late Middle English. So again, borrowed, later in English stages. And this word was borrowed from medieval Latin quotare. And it's originally from the breakdown is quote, how many, from the word quota. So our word quote, quotation, is actually the same source for our word quota, meaning did you get some sort of goal. And so the original sense of quotare was to mark a book with numbers or with marginal references, which is really cool because it's a numerical kind of sense. And then later it was to give reference by page or chapter. And then later it was to use somebody else's words.
So that's what probably the expression to get a quote on
the
thing comes from. It's not what they're saying, it's the amount.
Yeah, because it was related to numbers.
Wow.
Oh, how cool. I didn't even connect that. Thank you, David. Now this, mind you, quote, wholly unrelated to quoth.
I don't believe it.
Quoth comes from Old English quoth, which is the past tense of quith.
Oh.
This quoth, quoth the linguist, or quoth the raven, is actually related to our word bequeath.
Yeah.
Not to quote, even though quoth is literally to say.
Is there anything in German that still has it?
I actually don't know. I know in a lot of Old English texts, it shows up as quath because it was quathe. But I don't know that there are any Germanic languages where that sense or word actually survives.
Well,
it's a Proto-Germanic root. David's looking it up.
Yeah, and derived terms, descendants, Middle English.
A lot of old.
Middle German. Middle High German had, how do you think that?
I don't know, but Danish. It doesn't say old. It just says Danish and Icelandic. So I think the northern...
Kveda. Yeah, that's
Kveda
right.
and
Kveda. Kveda from Norwegian. Swedish is Kveda. But apparently it was in Middle High German was the last place it was seen, Queden, and then I don't know what Cimbrian is.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So it is in some Germanic languages still.
Wow. Cool.
Very cool. Hey, jinx. All right. So that's how you read etymologies. That's how you can get information. I took these etymologies from the New Oxford American Dictionary because they were pretty easy to read. Some etymologies are much more complex and give a lot more information, especially if you're looking at something like the Oxford English Dictionary. And yet, despite how complex they can get, those same sort of facts are true. It starts by saying, here's, the earliest stage of the language that we can find it, and then here's our backwards trace through time. That's just how etymologies are written. All right, so let's talk about borrowings. We've learned how to identify them if you're looking at etymologies to figure out, was this word actually borrowed? If so, from who? So now let's talk about why words get borrowed. First and foremost, words often get borrowed through having specific interactions with people of another speaking community. And so this is really good if you're thinking about conlanging. If you think about your speakers and who they interact with, do those people speak another language? And if so, what are they talking about? Because if you have two different languages, you know, usually if you're trying to communicate, it's for a specific purpose. Not like if we speak two different languages, I'm not going to sit down and chit chat about, I don't know, my favorite kind of socks. Like that would be a hard conversation to start. However, it'd be very hard if we spoke different languages. However, if we have a specific interaction where we can kind of like point and get certain needs met, we can do that. One example is the marketplace. And so when you buy and sell goods, you don't necessarily have to speak the same languages as long as you have some keywords that you can use and recognize and you know, some pointings and things like that. And indeed, this is one place where English borrowed words very early on. And so we're going to go way back to even the days before Old English, to Germanic language days. The Roman Empire was vast. And so I'm showing a map for on the screen if you're following along on video or looking at the PDF of the slides. It's got a map where it's like marked the Roman Empire in 117, the year 117. And it spreads, I mean, it's like all over Western Europe, a whole lot of Eastern Europe. It's pretty much south. The northern parts are for the most part untouched. England is actually the furthest north it went in terms of that direction. But then it went super east as well, all the way through like what we would call the Middle East. And then, of course, parts of the very northern bits of Africa are included as well. So, I mean, this is huge. And as this is the Roman Empire, they are like in charge of goods, in charge of commerce. Like these are like the things they're doing across all of these different areas. As a fun little side note, one of the cities of the Roman Empire was Augusta Trevirorum, which is way up here, and that's modern day Trier. And so I lived in Trier when I lived in Germany, and it indeed still has Roman structures in the city. So like you can see the Roman baths, there's an amphitheater, and then the big attraction is the Porta Nigra, which was the gate of the city, used to be walled in Roman days. And so there had been a lot of trade and commerce going on in Trier, where people who spoke a Germanic language on a daily basis interacted with Roman people to get, you know, goods bought and sold. And so some words that came into Germanic language, that sort of Germanic family at that time, which would again carry over into the development of English later. Some very, very early borrowings were words like pound. It was borrowed into Old English as punt. And it was actually from Latin libra pondo, denoting a Roman pound weight of 12 ounces.
Oh.
It's no longer 12 ounces for a pound, but that's where it came from. And so that was a super, super early borrowing. Again, even before like English was Old English. Another super early borrowing from those days was copper. And this one was actually based on Latin cuprum, from the phrase, I'm probably going to say this wrong, but Cyprium iis, which is Cyprus metal. And it was named that because Cyprus was the chief source of this particular metal that was copper. And so pound, copper, you know, thinking about weights, thinking about measures, the types of goods that were traded. These were the kinds of words. As a side note, there was an older Germanic word for the copper metal that got replaced by this borrowing. And that happens a lot where it's like, well, we're going to use your word. And then it just gets used so much that the native word is actually forgotten. And so specific interactions include marketplace. Later in English history, so that was again before the language left continental Europe. Now fast forward about 500 years. Another kind of specific interaction that led to a wave of borrowing was religion, because there were these settlements. So in about the year 600, so here we're looking at 7th century, between 600 and 700. The island area here, so like Britain, was settled on the east side by the Anglo-Saxons and Utes. This is where Old English is now developing as its own language, separate from what's on the continent, and has been for about 150 years at this point. The western part of the island is still inhabited by indigenous people there, so like the Bretons and so on. Here, this portion is important because those Anglo-Saxons and Utes were pagans. Mm-hmm. And the Roman Church was like, we can't have this. And they sent missionaries to England to, evangelize the area. And so they set up monasteries, and this is where where Christianity spread. It took hold. And a lot of words were borrowed directly related to concepts because of the monks and the religion that they brought. And so, for example, one word that was borrowed during this time frame was the word angel. And so in Old English, engel, it was ultimately, or angel probably. Later it was French. Never mind. It was engel at first. It was from ecclesiastical Latin, which was, of course, from Greek, angelos, meaning messenger. In later Middle English stages, it was actually replaced, the pronunciation. So Old English engel became influenced by the Old French pronunciation with angel. And so it became angel. And so that was a word borrowed, though, during these religious interactions. Another word is mass, which was like, so one very religious concept, angel. Here we've got mass, where people come together and do religious things. And so in Old English that showed up as massa, from the Latin word missa, meaning dismissal or prayer at the conclusion of a liturgy, so on. And it's ultimately from Latin miss, dismissed, which is from mittere, meaning to send or dismiss. And so it's really interesting, though, that we use the word mass to indicate like the sermon part. Like in modern days, I don't think of mass as some sort of ending. I think of like the whole thing as mass. Like you go to mass, meaning you're there for a whole event, whereas it actually came from this concept, meaning like to say a prayer and go.
It looks like it's related to the word dismiss, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it is. Yeah. It like directly is.
Interesting.
Right? Yeah. Another word borrowed during this time frame was candle, from Latin candela. And that ultimately came from a root meaning to be white or glisten. And so that's going to make you wonder what they used as light sources before then, or if they had a different name for candle. So it could be that they really used things that were more like built like torches, fires for light sources. And like the actual candles with the wax making and everything could have come during this stage, could have come with them. Because as monks were setting up monasteries, they were setting up internal spaces, like inside, where you needed to have a lot of light versus, in older times, you wouldn't have needed, at night you go to sleep. Mm-hmm. You didn't have books. You didn't have, like, there weren't reasons necessarily that you had to see. Like, you went to sleep, you woke up with the light. And so it's like this concept of needing a candle to read by is actually a newer thing. And it would have come with the monks because they also brought more reading things. Speaking of reading, another borrowing is school, which came from late Latin scholaris, from Latin schola. And so like that concept of having a school or something where you go to learn or study was directly tied to the rise of the monasteries and thinking about like the ways that monks were teaching concepts. As a side note, when languages borrow, like English did, you can get some really cool doublets where you're essentially reborrowing roots throughout history. but from different languages, different points in history. And so going back to that candle example, we borrowed it from Latin during Old English stages, but then much later, we borrowed the exact same root from French when we borrowed chandelier. And so it's all from the same source. It's all from Latin candela, except this later borrowing is from French. And the word in French at the time meant candle, but like we applied it to a different concept.
Well, chandelle meant candle. And so a chandelier would probably be somebody that put up candles or lit candles or something. How strange. Anyway.
And for us, it's a fancy light.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, those are what doublets are. You can find some really fascinating ones, including like I've seen online, like where you can find like apothecary, bodega, and boutique are all the same root. Mm-hmm. And we borrowed it from 3 different languages at 3 different points in history. It's crazy. So those are called doublets. All right, so these are some specific interactions where, you know, like a group of people speaking a different language are going to, you know, have words that you need to be able to say, talk about the same concepts or items, and you need them in your language. And so why come up with your own native word if you can just borrow what they're already saying? Another side note is that the effect of, you know, the monks bringing religion and having all these words, bringing all of that to England, a huge effect on the language went outside of spoken word. And they actually had a huge effect on the written language because prior to the monks arriving in England, Anglo-Saxon was written in runes, the old Futhark runes. And so it looked totally different. It's like if you've ever seen runic, you know, letter shapes, it's exactly what we're talking about here. And that's how the language was written. When the monks came, they brought with them the Roman alphabet. And after that, English became written in the, you know, the Roman alphabet. And so that became the writing system. The runes had, oh my goodness, I think they had 33 letters in the runic alphabet. And at the time that the Roman alphabet was being borrowed, you know, being used to transliterate English, at that time, I want to say there were only 22 letters in the alphabet because J wasn't there, W wasn't there yet.
Yeah.
U and V were the same letter shape. And I think it's Q that wasn't there. Anyway, there are some letters not in the Roman alphabet yet. And so it went from a system where those Futhark runes had a lot more letter shapes to associate with the sounds of Old English than the Roman alphabet did, which also gave rise to all the digraphs that we had in English. Those digraphs where it requires 2 different letters coming together to make one sound. Those date back to Old English days when the Roman alphabet was being applied to the language because there just weren't enough letters to actually cover the sounds of the English language. There were things like the win and the thorn and the eth were introduced, which were actually based on runic shapes. Those were introduced to the Roman alphabet for a while, but they have since fallen out of favor, which is unfortunate. I would really like the thorn to come back. The win, if you see it, just looks like a P and it's kind of confusing, and so that can stay away. We can use the W for that. But that is an addendum. So sometimes there's so much borrowing and interaction that the whole writing system can end up being changed and shifted. All right, so those were all specific interactions. But sometimes it's not that there are specific interactions between 2 or more speaking communities, it's that they're actually sharing the same physical space, the same geographical area. And that's what happens when we start going further into the history. So we got those words from the Roman missionaries in around the 7th century, late 7th century. Moving forward into even later Old English stages, so here we're talking 9th and 10th centuries, There was a lot of intermingling with, I'm going to call them Viking settlers, kind of conquerors, kind of, a little bit of everything. But there was what was called an established Danelaw. And so if you ever in history hear about the Danelaw, it was sort of just an imaginary line to say this territory is going to be for the these Viking peoples who have come in and are trying to take the land from the Anglo-Saxon tribes who are in that area. And so I ended up kind of giving the northern part of the island to those speakers. And it's like they were speaking a version of Old Norse at the time. And it's called the Danelaw because they were mostly Danish. And so in our heads, we, sometimes it's weird to remember that Old Norse is the mother language of Danish and, modern Norwegian and Swedish. And so, here it's like on the map, it shows you the specific area marked off with the Danelaw. But what's really cool is you can actually do a place name study in England, and you can literally see the dividing line where the Norse names are geographically, and then where the English-based names are. And it's really a north-south divide, and it kind of cuts across England diagonally. And so everything right down to like whether something is Shire, S-H-I-R-E, or whether something has like a ham ending can be broken down to Danelaw. It's kind of cool. So this intermingling was so pervasive that a lot of words were borrowed in. Part of this reason is because the languages they spoke were actually quite similar in many ways. So a lot of the roots were the same. It was really the grammatical endings, those inflections, that were quite different between the two languages. And so it's like kind of like sharing space and having neighbors where it's like you can understand most of the stressed syllables they're saying, but you can't understand any of the unstressed ones. So you're just kind of picking up what they're saying in between. It's kind of like that. And so we had some surprising borrowings from this period, including our modern word they. Yeah. So this pronoun they is actually borrowed from Old Norse there, the nominative plural masculine of sa. And maybe you're going, what? Because that's really surprising. Pronouns are not often borrowed from other languages. This is really bizarre. Mm-hmm. To break it down, this is one reason why we talk about things like the Leipzig-Jakarta list and the Swadesh list, is that they identify roots that are really not likely to be borrowed. And pronouns are always on there, like not likely to be borrowed. What I'm showing here is an infographic from National Geographic where they put on this sort of wheel of like the closer you are to the center of this wheel, the less likely the word or concept is to be borrowed from another language. So the more likely it is to be native. And that includes words like I, 2, 5, who, and 3. And of course, the pronouns are all centered around those kind of central areas because, again, it's just not likely to be borrowed. Linguists distinguish between these kinds of classes for lexical categories as open classes. Those are the lexical categories more likely to be derived, compounded, and are borrowed, like your nouns, verbs, adjectives, and manner adverbs. And then that contrasts with the closed classes, which are the lexical categories that are less likely to be derived, compounded, or borrowed. And those include pronouns, adpositions, conjunctions, determiners, and so on. Now these are, notice it says more likely and less likely, because we have plenty of content words like nouns that are totally native to the language and single roots, and so they're not derived, they're not compounded. So it's like, that doesn't mean they're all something fancy. And we also have examples like the pronoun they from closed classes. It's just that it's less likely, and it takes a lot more time for it to get situated in there as a closed class. Another example is a very common verb. Take was borrowed from Old Norse. And so that was borrowed from Old Norse taka, meaning grasp or lay hold of. And again, this is sort of like when you think about some basic roots in your language, you're not probably immediately thinking like give, take, I should borrow those. It's not an immediate thing because it's really not a kind of word that is quickly borrowed for a language. Another common everyday word borrowing that happened during this time of so much intermingling, egg. And so this actually took over the form a from Old English I, and this was borrowed from Old Norse.
They're both from the same root.
They are, and yet it was with the, if you see it in Middle English text, EY,
Yeah.
or iron, for in the plural, it's EI, modern day German is I.
I think they borrowed it because it's not distinct enough.
It could have been, but it's just another one of those like borrowings. And yeah, you're right. Like it probably at that point was starting to sound a heck of a lot like the pronoun for I, because what was ich at one point in older forms of English was starting to become ish, and then e, which became I. And so that form was starting to overlap with our pronoun form. That was actually one of the reasons that they was probably borrowed as well, because all of the third person pronouns in singular and plural forms were starting to completely overlap. So he meant both they and he.
Oh.
And then some of the plural like dative forms matched her, and that was the singular feminine, but was also the like plural something else. And so those forms were starting to overlap, and so that's probably one of the reasons that they borrowed it anyway. Another fun one is that we borrowed the word skirt from Old Norse skirta, and it just meant shirt. And Old English during this stage already had the word shirt, meaning shirt. And so it just kind of got assigned a different meaning. And so one quick like way to talk about like some of the Norse borrowings versus the English native is that if it had a sh, it was likely native to English, whereas if it has a ska, we probably borrowed it from Old Norse.
Right, because just like in German, the ska became sh.
Yeah.
And that's why in German, skiing is, ski is she.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, the Goofy cartoon where he skis. It's very surprising. The narrator says, skiing or sheing. It's like, really? Anyway.
Oh, gosh, David, I'm looking at the time, and I'm only on slide 65.
66, but yeah, 74 is going to be halfway.
And we may have to have this be a two-parter.
I think that we may have to.
How exciting is that?
Yeah.
Okay, so, let's continue with sharing spaces.
Yeah.
Because that was a lot of intermingling, and these communities, I won't say that they always got along, and there was a reason that the land at one point was just like given to be like, that's the Danelaw, that is separate from what's going on, with Anglo rule in the South. And so like there were political divides and reasons for that to have happened, but at the same time, it was really just like two communities interacting a whole lot. And so that led to a lot of those everyday borrowings. However, sometimes you share a space with other people, not out of sort of intermingling and settling in the same area, but because they came and conquered you. Mm-hmm. And that leads us to the Norman conquest. And so here I have a map of Norman England where you can see that there's like this portion of modern day France that was under Norman rule, so that kind of Normandy area. And that extended over to England. And, in 1066, they conquered. So they were now the rulers. It's not that they actually necessarily moved there en masse or anything. It was just that now if you wanted to get something done legally or at a higher level, you had to know some French, because they were the people in charge in terms of like law, in terms of business at the higher levels, in terms of schooling. But like your everyday life for the majority of England didn't change. It was like you're still speaking English. You're still chit-chatting with your neighbors in English. It was just if you wanted to do anything outside of that or above certain levels, you had to know some French. And so Through that, we have a lot of borrowings from French that refer specifically to things associated with law and society. So, for instance, our word judge came from Old French, originally from Latin, but we borrowed it into Middle English from Old French during this stage. As a quick note on some things that can happen when you borrow from one language to another, and this is not surprising, quite often the pronunciation shifted. And so here is an example. We have our word judge in English from French juge.
That should be juge.
Oh, this is how it was on Wiktionary.
Then that's probably how it was pronounced at that time, I'm guessing. But U became U.
Okay.
So
either juge or juge, whichever one. Notice here what I really want to focus on is not the vowel. It's on that consonant, j. Because it became judge, where we definitely have that affricate. We don't have the j of French juge or juge. All right. So part of that was because still at this time, English did not, it was working on developing, I should say, its phonemic voiceless fricatives, its voiced fricative class. Phonemically, Old English only had voiceless fricatives. The voiced fricatives were always conditions of sound changes, regular sound changes that you could predict. And so phonemically speaking, English just had F, S, esh,
go ahead.
And the h, and they became voiced in certain places. Oh, this one does say juge.
But that's for modern French.
Oh, I was probably looking at an older one.
I don't know when the sound change happened. And there's no pronunciation given for Old French. Modern French, it's definitely juge. But it had the same spelling in Old French, which I think was the French of the Norman conquest. So it may still have been the pure oo.
It's also Anglo-Norman, which became the language. And so, there's a lot of French varieties that came in at this time. But anyway, all that is to say, English did not have that voiced fricative in all places. It had to be conditioned. And so really it needed to be between two voice sounds. Most often intervocalically was where you found it. It did, however, have a voiced affricate that showed up at like word boundaries, for instance, in the word edge, which was in the language. And so instead of je, it went with the closest phoneme when it borrowed these French words. And we have things like joy, jury, and age, all of which were borrowed from French, and all of which in French were pronounced with a je, like joie, instead of joy is how we have it. Word internally, though, that voiced fricative was borrowed over and was treated like any other fricative in between two voice sounds. So that's why we have vision and lesion with a je, also borrowed from French during this stage. But we didn't need to say vision. It's like, hey, it's word internally. We don't need to treat it any differently from all the other voiced fricatives that happen inside words. And so any words that we have in English that have the je at the beginning and end of words is usually a borrowing that happened later, like how we have multiple pronunciations of genre. It could be genre or genre, and like that's something that was a later borrowing. Some other words that we borrowed during these stages were words like court. And so, again, borrowed from Old French. This is a legal-based word, and so it was, borrowed from the French rulers. One thing about spelling is that quite often when you see OU in spelling of words, that is the French influence. So it was either a word borrowed from French, or we just kind of applied the OU spelling to some native words to, make it look more polite, like our pronoun you. That was French influence.
Wow.
Isn't that kind of fun?
I had no idea.
Oh, good times. Another word, conveniently timed for roughly when we need to start thinking about this, tax. The word tax was borrowed. And so this was borrowed from Old French taxer. I don't know how you would say that X in Old French.
Which, let's see.
Taxer.
Taxi?
Cool. And that was from Latin to censure, to charge or compute.
Yeah. And so, what do you think?
Oh, well, I'm going to finish this. This section deals with this,
Got it.
and then we'll stop before the next section.
Okay.
Okay, so we are making this a two-parter in case you didn't follow along with what's happening there. Because I did want to talk about some couplets where, not doublets, mind you, but couplets where we end up reassigning meaning to some borrowed words. And so sometimes what happens when, for instance, we borrowed the word judge, Old English already had a word for judge. In the language, it was dema was the word for a judge, and it had the exact same meaning. And so here in this case, judge, when it was borrowed from French, just replaced the old native word, and that native word dema disappeared. However, that didn't always happen. Sometimes what happened was we borrowed the word and kept both the old word that was already in the language, borrowed the new word, but gave it a slightly different meaning, so that way to kind of justify having both words in the language. For instance, we borrowed the word beef. Now, in French, it just meant cow. Boeuf, boeuf, boeuf. It just meant cow. We also had the native word cow, Old English Q, of Germanic origin. And we kept both, except we applied them differently. If you see a cow in the field, you call it a cow. But if you have cow on the plate, you call it beef. Mm-hmm. We did that with other words like pork, borrowed from Old French. We had the native word pig. I love this, by the way. The etymology, it actually came from the word acorn, pig bread, literally pig bread. In other words, food for pigs. So, like, our word pig came from what they were fed.
But it's literally pig bread, so it came from pig.
I don't know. It's all backwards. I don't know. But it was a word not borrowed. It was a word that was already in English. And so we had pork on the plate, pig in the field. Venison, same thing, borrowed it from Old French. And so if you're going to eat something, you're going to eat venison, but you see it out in the woods and it's a deer. And so this is where we're going to stop, because even though we're still going to be talking about some French influences, we're going to start a new unit next time.
All right.
I can't believe I went a little bit too expansive. I was so excited. When I warned people I could go on for a whole semester about the history of the English language, it's because I know I can. I'm barely touching on all the things I really want to talk about, and I still have to split this into two parts.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has been your introduction to some types of borrowing, and a slight introduction, if you hadn't been introduced before, to the history of the English language. We're going to pick up next month with roughly the 1500s. That's where we're going to pick up. So this is a good split. This is like late Middle English. Now we're going to move into next time talking about some modern English borrowings and whatnot.
Right on.
And so, yay! Well, hope you enjoyed. And come back next time for more borrowing. Until then, stay grammar.
Bye, everybody.